Well, as I was supposed to be getting ready to preach this week, I've been thinking a lot about family because this week my mother-in-law from Texas, Naomi, is up, and Erica's dad and his wife are flying over the ocean to Australia to visit her brother and his wife and their new little one. And so I've been thinking a lot about family, and one of the things that I have in common growing up with Erica, she grew up in Oklahoma, I grew up in Ohio, was that we had boundaries. Boundaries as we grew up. All right, how many of you grew up, when you were growing up, you had boundaries? You had places where you were allowed to go and places you weren't allowed to go. Anybody have those things? All right. So for me, my boundary was, there was this creek behind my house, all right? And you could go into the woods, you could go into the cornfield, and then you could go to this side of the creek, all right? You couldn't go any further than that. And Erica's limits were a little less precise. She could go as far as she wanted, but she had to be able to do what?
Had to be able to hear Dad's whistle.
She had to be able to hear her dad's whistle, which evidently was incredibly loud.
We tested it.
You tested it, all right. And boundaries and limits, and so the question this morning before us, are boundaries and limits, are they good or bad? Good? Always good. All right, I don't know. I'm seeing some, so I want to refresh with us for just a second here. When, in general, when Lutherans ask the question, is something good or bad, what is the answer?
Yes.
Yes, that is correct. All right. So are boundaries and limits good or bad? There are times when they're definitely good, definitely important, definitely godly. And yet there's other times when maybe the boundaries need to be shifted a little bit, shaped a little bit. Because on one hand, they keep us safe, right? Our parents knew where we were. They kept us protected. They kept us where we were supposed to be. And on the other hand, sometimes we can become so focused on the boundary, on that line, we could forget the reason why we have that boundary and that limit. All right, so let's pretend for a second I'm hanging out behind my house as a kid, and there's this little kid that's lost on the far side of the creek. All right, and he's crying. It's out in the middle of nowhere. What do I do? Am I like, I'm sorry, I wish I could help you. But you're on your own. You're outside of the boundary, all right? And what if Erica saw somebody who was hurt and was helping them, and she couldn't hear her dad's whistle and get back right away? Again, it's complicated. Boundaries and limits are challenging. We have to think sometimes. And we have boundaries and limits for good reasons, for important reasons, for necessary reasons. And yet, I have to wonder if boundaries are always the final word, that limit, that line. And this is the question that I had as I read over the lessons from this Sunday, because we hear about this guy Jesus, and we hear about this guy named the Apostle Paul. And both are fairly important people to us. And these two guys often seem to be pushing the limits, pushing the traditional boundaries. All right? In our gospel lesson, we hear about Jesus touching and healing a sick person, right? Last week, you remember, we talked about how there are rules about touching sick people and ill people. And he's crossing all sorts of religious and social boundaries by doing so. And these are important boundaries. Again, what happens when a sick person touches a healthy person? What can happen? They can get sick. Yeah, that's why Jesus shouldn't be touching the sick person. That's what they were thinking. It wasn't safe. And yet Jesus touches her. And then Paul, all right, we have Paul talking, and he writes that he keeps Jewish laws and customs, all right? And he does this when he's with Jewish people. And he keeps these because then he has the opportunity to preach to them the good news of Jesus' grace and forgiveness. So he keeps boundaries when he has this opportunity. At the same time, there were people that didn't know Jesus that weren't Jewish. So he would not keep Jewish law and boundaries. in order to preach the good news to them, right? So do Paul and Jesus show us that rules are silly and always bad? What's your gut response? Situational, yeah. Again, yes. And do they prove that boundaries are meant to be broken? No, that's not the point. We have seen how many, boundaries, traditions, and limits and rules can be good. They can be godly. They can be important and necessary. But then the question is, what Michael just brought up, is how do we know? How do we know when a boundary or a limit is good and when it needs to be challenged, when it needs to be expanded or changed? And I wonder if Paul's words to the church in Corinth give us some guidance. He says in verse 22, I think it's interesting, he says, "To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that I might save some." Paul has pushed, expanded, and ignored some traditional boundaries in order to save some. And what is Paul focusing on there? Is Paul interested? Does he mean I have become all things to all people so that I might save some money? No, that's not the point. And does he say, I've become all things to all people so that I can save some time? No, Paul is talking about saving people. Paul is willing to challenge traditional boundaries because he's trying to save and help people through the good news of Jesus Christ. And I wonder if this could be a guide for you and me and the church when it comes to rules and traditions and boundaries. And I wonder if Jesus and the Apostle Paul tell us and show us, both by their words and their actions, that people are always more important to God than rules, regulations, and boundaries. That the important reason are the people. So how could this challenge and disturb some of the traditional boundaries that I hold dear, or that you hold dear, or the church holds dear? I want to tell you a story because you have to understand that pastors are the kings and queens of boundaries. All right? We have whole classes and workshops dedicated to boundaries and who can do what and when and with who and all that kind of stuff. And it's good because it teaches us how to protect ourselves and how to protect the church, both with our words and our actions. So we're sitting in this class that we're learning about boundaries. All right, we have a class in seminary called Pastoral Care. All right, and it's about meeting with people and hospital visits and all that kind of stuff. And so our professor, he's our teacher. He begins to tell us about when he was an AIDS chaplain in New York City. And this was in the early 1980s when AIDS was an absolute death sentence. All right, and people were terrified, and people didn't know how you got it or why you got it or any of that stuff. And my professor went to visit a gay man who was infected and dying. He was in the end stage. And he sits down next to the man's bed. And he's been visiting dying people all day. And this guy laying in the bed, he says, "You look very, very tired." And my professor said, "Yeah, I'm wiped out. This is it's really tough." And the patient says, "Well, why don't you lay down here in the bed with me and rest for a few minutes?" And at this point, the entire class is dead silent because we've all taken our boundary classes and we all know the right answer. No, don't do that. Whatever you do, that's not a good idea. That's not what pastors are supposed to do. But my professor said that he laid down next to the man. They're fully clothed, and waited till he heard the sick man's breathing slow down. And he heard the man fall asleep. And my professor got up and left. Shortly afterwards, the man died. And this man's partner called my professor to perform his funeral. And my professor goes in to meet him, and he says, I'm Dr. So-and-so. And the man stops him and says, "Oh, I know who you are." He says, "Everyone in the gay community knows who you are. We heard that you aren't afraid to touch us or to be near us. My partner said that he was no longer afraid to die because of your actions. He knew that God had not abandoned him, and there was nothing that could separate him from the love of Christ. I still don't know if I agree that my professor should have broken that boundary. I don't know if I think that my professor should have laid down in that bed with that man. But I do know that Jesus Christ would have laid down next to that dying man. And this is the power and the scandal of the gospel. That God does things that sometimes we think God shouldn't do. God's forgiveness, mercy, and love is for the entire world. And Jesus is willing to do anything to show us that. I mean, if you look at it, Jesus is always doing things that he shouldn't do. You know, he touches the infected and the contagious and the sick. Jesus treats women and people from other religions with respect and honor. Jesus helps a soldier from an enemy army. Jesus gets nailed to a cross and dies for us. And yet he doesn't stay dead because he wants to show us that nothing can keep God away from us. Nothing you say, nothing you do, nothing you think. There is no boundary that our Lord Jesus Christ will not cross to save us from ourselves. I want to end today with a challenge for you all. I want to take a second here. You know, today we've all received God's forgiveness and absolution at the beginning of the service. Our slates are wiped clean. In a second, you're all going to be invited to come up and take communion and receive God's forgiveness and love. I want you to think of one person in your life. One person who believes that they are beyond God's love. I want you to picture that one person in your life that you know that they think they're outside of Jesus' mercy and compassion. Do you have that person pictured? Now go tell them.